Hello, and welcome to episode 116 of the Elevate Your Running podcast. My name is Sarah Mandershed. I'm your host today, and I'm here with a very special guest. Her name is Emily Saul, and she is a sports psychology coach from the Boston area. And we're going to dive into all things racing, mindset, and how to show up to be your strongest self in race season. And hey, she's run the Boston Marathon. So we're going to tackle some Boston Marathon mental tips too in this episode. Hey, Emily, how's it going?
Hey, Sarah, I'm great. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Thanks. It's so exciting to have you here. And we've just been chatting before I hit record, kind of getting to know each other, talking a little bit about our experiences at Boston and how we came to be as a running coach and a sports psychology coach. Um, And we have a mutual client. Her name's Tamana. Hey, Tamana. I know Tamana's listening.
Hey,
She
Tamara.
connected us. So thank you for that. And you've helped Tamana so much in the last year with her mindset and flowing through injury and all the things that kind of come up with racing. So I know today's
Yeah,
going to be a really great episode. Do you mind giving an introduction to like who you are and what a sports psychology coach does and how they
yeah,
can benefit runners?
absolutely. Well, I'll start with my background. I am, as you said, a sports psychology coach. I'm also a licensed mental health counselor. So I like to look at it as having the clinical side of psychology. So really understanding sort of what makes people tick in that regard, and then a specialty in sports psychology. So really focusing on how we take the psychology of our minds just as human beings and applying that into the sport world. So how as athletes can we better understand how our brains work, how our like minds and bodies work together in order to essentially optimize or maximize what we're able to do as athletes. And that really is that's the goal of sports psychology. So I got into this field because I've been an athlete and just like a really physical person my whole life. I grew up, running around as the youngest of four siblings, and a great big like outdoor space in where we grew up, and that just was really influential, kind of pivotal in forming who I was. Like I've always been somebody who's been in motion, in action, in activity. It's a big part of how I like express myself. And I went to college, undergrad, and walked onto the rowing team. So I had not been a rower prior to that, but had some cousins, and then my sister, who was the oldest, she rowed at Boston College. And so when I went to school at the University of Tulsa, and I learned that there was a Division I rowing program, I was like, this is a cool opportunity. So I walked on. I ended up earning a scholarship and having just a really significant time as both an athlete and a student. So I often describe that I got an education both in academics, did my undergrad in psychology, and then also a whole education in athletics and really the sports psychology of it. And so the idea that I could put those two things together, like sport and psychology, I was like, that's a job. Like that's a thing. It just seemed like a really perfect fit. And I really went into it kind of believing that if everybody had the opportunity, like everyone in the world could participate in team sports, the world would just be a better place. And so I've always had a sense that through sport, through movement, not just traditional organized sports, but really through a movement practice, that as individuals, we can learn and develop and grow in the ways that we need to. And I think that's one of the reasons why as adults beyond our childhood years, that a lot of us continue to pursue not just organized sport, but pursue some kind of movement practice. So whether it's running or strength training, or you love a yoga practice, or you like swimming or cycling or hiking or whatever it is, but that we find these ways to move our bodies, to be outdoors, to challenge ourselves. And ultimately, we're really finding these ways to develop and grow. That we as beings are always looking to develop and grow. The human developmental process doesn't just stop after childhood, it continues throughout our entire lifespan. And so we're often using our movement practice and our relationship with sport. I definitely use my relationship with running to help better understand myself and continue to grow in my own life. And I think that's how I see, most of the folks that I work with. That's how people are using their movement practice. It's a medium or a forum in which they can continue to learn about themselves, to be in relationship, and continue to challenge and develop themselves. And it's just this like really beautiful space to get to decide what it is you're seeking out. You set goals, you build intentions, you develop practices, you work on like discipline and defining success. You work on understanding your values and pursuing things that are important to you, finding meaning and purpose, all kinds of things that just are like, I think, the richness of life. And we get to explore it and work on it very much in that movement practice. So it's one of the reasons why I refer to our movement practice as both a classroom and a laboratory.
Mm.
A classroom because it's that space, as I was just describing, to just learn about yourself. Like, what am I doing? What does matter to me? What feels important? What gives me purpose? What challenges me? Where do I feel anxious? Where do I feel calm? And then also a laboratory because we get to try things out. We actually get to cultivate and craft who we are as individuals through the practices that we take, but also the mindset that we bring to those practices. And so you may find yourself to experience a lot of anxiety, for example. It's a pretty common thing in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and you might realize that as you are training for some kind of running event and maybe pursuing a race, that you also experience some anxiety, both in the training and or before that race. And if this is something that you're interested in, like learning how to do differently or trying out some different ways of talking to yourself, building that self-talk and inner dialogue, or working on some different strategies of how do you navigate some of that anxiety. When you have a context like running or sport in general, that you can try some things out, and there's actually a space and a structure to be able to try these things out, we can discover like, oh, I tried that and it works. And not only do I want to continue doing that in my running, but I think I'd like to use that strategy at work or with my family or in these other environments.
Mm.
And so there's this beautiful kind of crossover of who we are as athletes and who we are as people. And so our movement practice really gives us that space to first better understand in that like kind of classroom environment. And then also in that laboratory environment to really get to experiment and craft and develop who we are in all ways. So
That is so cool. And I'm a big believer that like how we show up in training is how we show up in life, how we
yeah,
show up on race day. And like when we get the opportunity to really practice different things in training, and I'm a big believer in like the fueling and the hydration, like we
yes,
gotta train the gut. We also have to train the mind.
very much.
And if
Yeah,
we can practice that through our 16-week training cycle, like you're the runner, the athlete's going to be so dialed in on race day that
yeah.
it's going to be really hard to deviate away from that and just stay the course, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It's gonna be so much easier for them to be able to carry out and implement practices literally that they've been practicing than it would be to even like a couple of days before be like, I've got some really great ideas, but I'm going to try them out in the most highest stress environment that I've been in to date. Just that, and that's where the psychology comes into it. Like we know that when we're in higher stress environments, we tend to revert to the most comfortable
Mm-hmm.
or the most practiced, what essentially is our previously mastered skills. So if we're using certain strategies for coping with challenge in particular, and we're like, I've got new ones that I really want to use. If they're so new that they're not practiced enough, that in that higher stress environment, they're not going to be the ones that we revert back to, then we're going to have a hard time implementing them. So that is there's really good, as you said, to be able to build these kinds of practices into 16 weeks of physical training that we're kind of paralleling the mental training. It's super important. So ultimately, that goes back to your initial question. Like that's what sports psychology really is. It's about looking at, for the individual, what are the tools, what are some of the like mindset or framework that's going to be most helpful for me as an individual athlete in being able to go and take on the challenge, the physical challenge, but also the emotional and psychological challenge that the events kind of entail. And we can work on building those kinds of skills through training. But ultimately, if you are going to race or you're going to compete or you're going to have some sort of bigger objective where there's really a performance, we have to build the skills to be able to do that. And so it's not just about the body, it's about building the mental skills and then integrating them together, so that when it really comes down to performance, you get not just your average everyday you actually get the best you that you can produce on that day.
And that's pretty cool. That's what we all want. That's what we're training for,
Yeah.
whether we're racing or running. Like we just want to be the best, our best self, our strongest self,
Yeah.
and maybe having the option of like doing what we want to do on race day,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I train a lot of athletes for Boston, and that's typically how we go into training of like, well, let's go in and train.
Mm-hmm.
And if you decide on race day that you just want to go in and maybe not race, but run and
Mm-hmm.
develop, a strong 26.2, let's do that.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have those options and to have kind of that flexibility, but also knowing like you can flip the switch and be ready to go if you need and want to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I encourage people to think about too is, I agree with that. That sort of continuum of race day strategy, as in you can participate in a racing in a running event, that doesn't require you to take the strategy of racing. um,
Mm,
and no matter where you choose to sit in that continuum of participation, in terms of how intensely you want to race, my objective for everyone is that you always, throughout the race, throughout the physical experience, start line to finish line, that you always feel emotionally and intellectually like you've got choices.
mhm,
So the number one reason why people will start to sort of fall apart or feel like they're protecting themselves or just sort of feeling overwhelmed is because they have a perception of a lack of choice.
mm,
And that can happen if they have created such strong or strict expectations about what success is. Like, this is going well if and I'm doing a good job and it will be successful if I'm running exactly this pace, for example, and a certain mile goes by. And if I'm running that pace, then I feel all is well and I can continue. But if I see that that pace is off and I feel like, oh no, like it's over, this whole thing is out of control, not going to happen, I can't do anything about it, that is the feeling of a lack of choice. And as soon as we have that, so it's a lack of agency. As soon as we
mm.
have that, we tend to, our brain tends to go into survival mode. So we start seeking to, our brain starts to seek to protect us from the thing that feels like the threat. If we
Mm.
set it up that failure to meet that particular time is the worst thing that could happen, then a time becomes the threat. And running toward that, not hitting that time, becomes the threat. And then our bodies follow up and seek to shut us down from doing that, to protect us from it. And so that's why
Yeah.
we often sort of feel that almost like domino effect of like things shutting down. It's very much just a protective mechanism, and something that doesn't have to happen, especially because we can build a mindset that says, no matter what happens, I have choice. I have choice about what's the next action that I take. How do I respond to this? What's my approach going to be? What am I going to say to myself? What's the best decision I can make right now? So even just building in and practicing throughout training this idea that no matter what happens, you have choice about it. And we can get more specifically into like what that means in different situations. Like in a race, not
Yeah.
getting that time might be like, well, I don't have a choice about the outcome. Well, guess what? You never did. Um, you don't have control of the outcome, but you do have a choice about whether you tell yourself that's the end of the world or whether that's the most normal thing that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if internally you get a different reaction from your body, which is really your nervous system, to those two interpretations that this is the end of the world or this is totally normal, then we have to build the skill of picking, selecting, and really following through on which choice is going to be more helpful for you in that moment, and ultimately picking something that neutralizes or has a very minimal fear-based response is going to be most helpful.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's I'm thinking about myself. I'm thinking about all the athletes that I coach and just
Yeah.
how valuable tools like that would be, especially in a race environment. Let's get into like that 26.2.
Yeah,
It's marathon season, right? Like,
absolutely.
how does an athlete kind of show up to race morning feeling like they have choices?
Um, so number one, practicing that throughout the training is going to be
Hmm.
the most effective way to show up on race day feeling like they have choices. And then the other way to sort of build out that concept is to think about the variety of things that you do have choice about. So very often, and anyone who's worked with me has heard me say this, but my least favorite thing about the sport of running and the sort of industry of running, is that the culture of running will tell you that the only things that matter are your distance and your time.
Hmm.
Right? So running says if you're running faster, you're a better runner. And if you're running longer distances, you're a better runner, especially in the world of marathon. Um,
Hmm.
and the idea that those are the only things that matter, I think, is incredibly detrimental to people because,
Hmm.
number one, that's just not true. It's just that they're very concrete, they're very measurable, they're very visible, right? We can put up at the finish line a clock and it tells everyone what everyone's time is. But we don't get to see some kind of display or a scoreboard or marquee of what else that person was working on or what else was meaningful to that person in that race context. Um,
Hmm.
and so the idea that going into a race, you have a choice about what is important to you. You have a choice about what you decide is important for you, what has meaning and what gives you purpose. And then ultimately, all the way through the race, you have a choice about what you put your attention on. And that I think could not be underestimated as probably the most significant influence in terms of our experience. But I think about our experience in a race is sort of like having your hands on the steering wheel of a car. Like if you have your hands
Mhm.
on the wheel, you really get to influence like where the car goes. Okay. And so if you, with your hands on the steering wheel, guide your attention, your thoughtful and just focus-based attention to things that are much more helpful for you or things that you actually have the ability to influence, you will end up feeling, experiencing the day very differently than if you only drive your focus to something that you don't have a lot of control over,
Mhm.
right? So even when you're incredibly well trained and you can say, I'm the fittest I've ever been, all signs point to I'm going to have this amazing day, my body feels good, I believe it can happen. Well, that's like a very small portion of what actually influences your race day. There's all the logistics. There's how did your travel go? There's how did you sleep? Not only the night before, but the 2 and 3 nights before
Mhm.
the race. It's have you been sick recently? Are there any other niggles going on in your body? It's even on race day, what's going on with your stomach? Is there any kind of GI distress? There's all the weather. There's everybody else around you who can influence you, whether you like it or not. And there's also just the specificity of the race, right? If you happen to be showing up to the starting line of Chicago versus the starting line of Boston, I don't know, you're going to have a different experience.
Mhm.
Not only because one's fall and one's spring, but one's really flat and one's really hilly. And there's just a million things that make them different. And
Yeah.
so if we focus only on those metrics of time and distance, like, I will have a good day. I will feel good about myself if I hit this time on this course over this distance. Well, that's not a lot in your control. Again, it's a very small portion in your control. But if instead you focus on things like where am I going to place my attention? How am I going to stick to and keep myself both attentive to and then really reward myself mentally and emotionally for sticking to my nutrition and my hydration? How am I going to make like good choices about if things start feeling hard? Am I going to tune into that feeling or am I going to tune out to something else that may sort of feel easier to focus on? How what scale of focus am I going to have? Am I going to be really zoomed in to like this moment is everything, or am I going to zoom out and use some of that bigger perspective building kind of skills? So all of those things we have, as well as many others, we have choice about. So the more we practice those kinds of things going building up in the training, the better off we're going to be. But the more we're prepared and actually quite intentional about which of those things I'm going to be focused on and making choices about because I actively can, that's going to be beneficial in the execution of a race.
Yeah, so you probably find more athletes performing better, even if we're not quote unquote like using an outcome goal, right? But like if if they are practicing focus and they are practicing, I call them the performance standards of
Mm-hmm.
like these are the ways I want to show up when I race.
Yeah.
Like I want to race strong. I want to
Mhm.
hold a strong effort. I
Mhm.
want to be focused.
Yep.
I want to be relaxed.
Mhm.
Typically the outcome goal is kind of in that like space that you where you want it to be. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
fair to say. Yeah, and I love that you call them performance standards.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I love that name of it because I think about for each person, sometimes it can be more about kind of the quality of. For some people, it's more of that internal state. For some people,
Yeah.
it's using particular practices, and so it gets really kind of custom to each person. But I really look at the big picture, what I'm trying to get people to focus on. What are the things that when you're focused on them actually help you feel really good? Like just you run well. And ultimately, what's happening is that if our focus is entirely on an outcome that we have very little control over, we hold tightly to that. We attach ourselves, our sense of self, to like whether that's going to happen or not. Um, what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up to have a lot of fear-based reactions, because
Mhm.
every little piece of information that sort of comes up along the way is either going to be like a threat to that, more likely than not, or it's going to reinforce that like that's the thing that matters, but it's still going to increase the pressure, because if we kind of got away with that moment, like what about the next one? What's going to come up next? And so the more we focus on that outcome, the more we tend to operate from a place of fear and worry.
Yeah.
Um, and instead, so I describe it as like, if in your focus you've got this outcome and it's right here, like front and center, you can't really see anything else besides that. And so it's not that we have to tell ourselves, oh, I don't care about time. Oh, that doesn't matter. Like, I'm just going to do this for fun, or I'm just going to focus on these other things, because those are the things. That's a lie. You do care. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
okay to care about it, but we want to take it from front and center, and we want to put it like back of our head, just like just plop it way back here. At the very least, put it in the periphery so that it's not front and center, but it's
Mm.
over here. So we know it's there somewhere. And then we put our focus, sort of take that steering wheel and direct it toward those performance standards, those things that are within our control, that
Mhm.
are that we can influence very easily, that along the way we can get really good cycles of feedback. Am I doing it? Yes, I'm doing it. Great. Am I doing it? Yes, I'm doing it. Great. Instead of, am I doing it? I don't know, it's not the finish line yet. Am I doing it? I mean, I did, but I don't know, maybe I'll feel bad later. Like, it's such a different experience. And so
Yeah.
when we hold our attention on those things that are meaningful to us, that help us to feel at our best when we're able to run, and that we have influence over and lots of opportunity for positive feedback, reinforcement about, that is essentially the act of taking your mind and getting it out of the way, that your physical body can just
Getting it over.
go do what it's capable of doing.
Mhm.
I described it to somebody earlier this morning, that physical body, when we can get our mind out of the way, our physical body it's just a mammal, right? It's an animal body. And if you think about how dogs and horses will just like work, like sled dogs or horses they just will like do the physical work. They don't go like, but will it be hard? They just go and do it, right? And if we can get our mind out of the way and even put it in a position to be supportive of that physical body, our bodies will just do what they're capable of doing. So if
That's
you
so
have
true.
had that tremendous training cycle and you're like, I'm as fit as I've ever been and I feel really strong and I think it's all capable and all signs are pointing to, then the very best thing you can do for yourself is frame your mind to simply be out of the way of what your body is able to do, because it'll do it.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool. I have experience with this. For longtime listeners, so I ran a half marathon personal best last fall. I was shooting for sub 90,
Yeah.
and the first 5K, I was like nervous, finding my pace, and it just wasn't feeling good.
Mm.
And it finally took, it was like around mile like 4-ish in the race where I thought, oh my gosh, I don't think I'm going to do this.
Mm.
And then I was like, no, relax,
Mhm.
focus, you got this. And I
Yeah.
ran the race of my life. Like I
Wow.
got out of my head mid race, which is
Yeah.
like wild.
Yep.
And I had a terrific last, like however many miles that is,
Mhm.
10.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. And I came
Yeah.
in well under 90 minutes. And that was the
Fantastic.
training cycle that every time I was out for a workout or a long run, every single rep, I would check my splits, right?
Mm.
And when I would nail it, I would tell myself, usually out loud. So I probably looked a little, woo, whatever.
Like a
I will
runner, I
tell
say.
myself, like, "You're proving yourself right, you're doing it."
Yeah.
And I'll even have athletes do that in my in-person on Wednesday nights of like,
Mhm.
when you come through the line, if you hit your split, say it out loud. Like, I
Mhm.
want to hear it. I want you to hear it. And I think there's so much value to that because you build yourself up
Mm.
in the process of the training cycle. And the
Yeah.
mind is the most powerful asset that we have. And it can either propel you
Yeah.
or it can absolutely break you down.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. I think it can, I sort of visually, I visualize it in terms of the influence of our mind on our body. It can either be this, like, I think of like a concrete, like Jersey barrier, like it can be this like very definitive obstacle in front of
Yeah.
you, or it can be like a buoy, almost like a life raft. Like it can support
Supporting.
you and make it
Yeah.
easier. But it usually doesn't doesn't do both at the same time. It's either like one or
No.
the other.
No, and I mean, it definitely does take practice, and I practiced
Mhm.
it throughout the entire training cycle to
Yeah.
use it on race day,
Mhm.
and it is interesting how it can ebb and flow from training cycle to training cycle.
Yeah.
What's kind of your advice for an athlete who maybe is honing in on those performance standards and they really are still trying to control what they can?
Mhm.
The outcome is still in maybe their mind disappointing. What's kind of feedback for you in that kind of in that environment for that athlete?
Um, yeah, like it. So if I was talking with someone after the fact, I would
Mhm.
probably do a little bit of like almost like dissection of their mindset from before. If I'm working with someone beforehand, I work really carefully to like embrace and clarify what that specific goal is that they are working
Mhm.
toward, and not just for the sake of like, okay, that's the time that you're aiming for, but I really try to understand, like, why does that matter to you? Sort of, what for you, what does that represent? And what that does is it helps us to start to get a better understanding of um, like what's the real meaning for them, like what are they actually pursuing in this, because I'll be the first one to say, like, the numbers that we define as our goals they are arbitrary. They're just
Yeah.
arbitrary. Like
Mhm.
they only mean something because you've decided that they mean something. And so like your 90 minutes, right? Like that could, and I'm just throwing things out, but sub 90 half, that could mean for you this sense of like it's that's a number that when I started running, that I envisioned it would mean that I'm like undoubtedly a fast runner. Like
Yeah.
I can't even
Deal.
deny it for myself that like that's a fast time for a half. And so I'll be faced with like having to believe that about myself if I can run that time. And the want to feel like a fast runner is
Mhm.
really what's behind that sense of, there's elements of like validation and a sense of
Mhm.
achievement, and really when it comes down to it, a sense that like what I do matters.
Yeah.
I, as a person, like there's value and worth in what I'm doing. And it's okay that those things are connected to the ways that we express and explore our like way our power and our validity in the world. It becomes not super healthy when I only think I matter if I can, and therefore if I didn't hit that time, like I as a person don't matter. So
Yeah.
we always have to work on that if that's coming up for people too. But ultimately, really what we're trying to like better understand is what that what is represented in that number, and then we're going to take that like representation, and we're actually going to look for other ways to access that also in the process of the race.
Mm.
So if you want to feel like you're, part of hitting that sub 90 half marathon time is really feeling like you are a like strong and competent runner, then
Mhm.
I'm going to start to work on a process, like an experiential awareness throughout the race. How are we going to know while you're running, not just at the finish line, but how are we going to know while you're running that you're a strong and competent runner? Where are you going to feel your strength? Where is that going to come from? So we might work on building some body awareness or doing some like kind of physical check-ins as you're running along to make sure that you are mentally and emotionally still connected to your sense of strength and power as you're running along. We and other sort of variations of that we're going to build these essentially other metrics that are accessible in the process so that you can both feel that thing that you're looking to feel, not in fearful anticipation of what if it
Mm.
doesn't happen, but in
Mhm.
the actual act of, I am doing it, I am feeling it. Of course I can. And that's how we get the sort of mental buoy that supports your body still physically doing what it was able to do and is still able to do.
Oh, that's pretty cool. That's great.
Yeah.
I find that like super helpful, and it's very true. Like there's so much that comes with these arbitrary goals that we set and
Mhm.
wanting to be, maybe it's a BQ at Boston
Right.
or it is the first BQ or whatever.
Hmm.
Um it can be, we can just put a lot of pressure on ourselves.
Yeah.
And now it's like a time where a lot of athletes are maybe near taper or
Hmm.
they're in taper.
Hmm.
And what's your advice for those athletes who are maybe going in to that big A goal race
Hmm.
and they're feeling confident, but they're also feeling nerves or some anxiety? What are some things that they can be doing now to kind of set themselves up for success on race day, whether they've
Yeah.
been practicing during training or maybe they haven't been practicing during training?
Right. And like we are where we are in the
Yeah.
time frame, right? So we're not looking to add any like stress or emotional demand on people and go like, I should have started. Like there is
Yeah.
always like it's an infinite practice of running. So we learn what
There's
we can
always
now and
another
we take it
race.
forward. But right now, one of the things that I find really, really helpful for people at this sort of phase of the training cycle is I personally really like to look at a marathon training cycle as having two very distinct parts. So one is training and
Mhm.
one is race day. And the reason that I do that is because when you spend such an enormous amount of time, weeks and weeks and weeks, like 12 to 16 weeks training for something, and then you give yourself, your physical body and mind, the expectation that when I stand at the starting line, everything I've done is just, it's on the table.
Mhm.
And I've got to prove whether that was worth it. I cannot think of another scenario that is higher pressure or that feels like higher stakes or that like is going to stress people out. I
Yeah.
think it's kind of absurd. And so that's why I say training is training. There's a start to it. There's a finite start to it. You know the day when you're like, starting my marathon training, like workout number one, week one, long run number one. Like the beginning to it, and it's got an end. And whether you want to
Yeah.
consider that like, when you finally hit your taper, the start of your taper, or you consider that like your shakeout run before your race, but give it an end and
Yeah.
give yourself the emotional permission to say, I did it. I did it. I did the very best job that I could given the circumstances in training for this marathon. Because we cannot objectively every single time do the very best we ever could do because we're not living in a laboratory. We're not living under
Mm.
controlled conditions. Most of us are not professional athletes getting paid. We're like doing other jobs or caring for kids or have other things going on. And so to be able to look at it and say, this training cycle, like life things, work things, whatever, those things happened as they did. I got sick or I had
Mm.
whatever little injury or niggle, all that. And I did the best I could to get to this point, and here I am, and it is done. Check. Good job. It is. It just is. Period. Like put a period after that and let it be so that you can feel that sense of nothing's on the table. Nothing is at stake. When you go to race, your training is not like up for grabs whether you earned it or made it worth it or not. Allow yourself that feeling of saying it was worth it. I got from it what I did. I learned what I did. I developed in the way that I did. I can always have learned the things that I want to do differently. There's always things that we could like improve or build on for the future. But to be able to go into that, like standing at the starting line, being like, okay, the only thing I have to do right now is just see how this turns out. I get to see what happens today. That's it. That's the only thing that's on the table. So that's my big piece of advice to people in framing a race day. There's lots of strategy about how you can build a mental race plan, but big picture, that's one of the more helpful things that people can do.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I could just feel how light
Mm,
that felt versus thinking back to the years that I've run Boston or other major marathons.
yeah.
Um, the energy can be off the charts. I think for any race, the energy
Yeah.
is off the charts. You have, depending on the size of the race, let's say you're in a major marathon like the city of Chicago, you're in Boston,
Yeah.
you have thousands of tapered marathoners running around carbo loaded out. Like their glycogen stores are ready, primed and loaded, and
Yep.
the energy is wild,
Yeah.
right? What do you suggest for an athlete like on race morning where they're surrounded by
Mm.
a lot of energy, a lot of maybe nervous, anxious
Mhm.
um energy to be able to find that like calm space for them
Yeah.
to lean in and let go and not let the outside world kind of impact them?
Yeah, not let that outside world sort of decide for you what
Yeah.
state you're gonna be in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're doing such a good job of painting the picture of these influences that really, like, can influence and sometimes determine our internal state, like the place from which we're like trying to go out and do this great big thing. So there's one piece of just like foundational information which I think is helpful for everybody to know, which is that there is a relationship that's been shown in research that talks about the relationship between performance and activation. So in the research, uh, it is called stimulation. It might even be called stimulation, but I call it internal activation. Right? It's that sort of that state of like energy, buzz, hype, jazz, like all the stuff that's going on inside. Um, and what we know is that if someone has a very low level of internal activation, which can even show up as like disinterest or just kind of general apathy, like not super engaged, then their level of performance is going to be pretty low. But
Mm.
as their internal like state of activation increases, as I get more energized, as I potentially get more focused, as I get more engaged in it, that activation increases. My performance is also going to increase up to a sort of optimal state for me. It's not the same level of activation for each person. But when I reach my like maximal or optimal state of activation, I'm going to reach optimal performance. And then if I continue to get activated, more energy, my performance is actually going to go down. So it's got this
Mm.
inverted U shape. Um, to it. And so with that, I encourage everybody to kind of think about and just recognize that we do need to have some level of activation that is helpful and in fact necessary for our own kind of best performance. But too much is going to be unhelpful.
Mhm.
So for example, I think about in the like day or two ahead of time. If you start to feel your body kind of turning on, and I don't just mean like kind of the taper stuff, that coil winding winding
Mhm.
up through the taper. I'm talking about that, like I feel like it's time to race. Like you wake up and your body is just like, I'm ready to go. That's a good sign that your nervous system is like preparing you to be in that more activated state. The timing is not so helpful because 2 days before is not when you need to be ready to go. So, like, being in that state to go to the expo and then see everyone, like it's probably going to be too much and too soon. um, so I really encourage like having awareness and then conversation with your body. So it's like, okay, I got it. Like, nice job. Good job. Nervous system activating. Like, you are getting me ready for the race. Not yet. Like, it's 2 days away. So we're good. It's okay to actually rest. It's okay to continue like preserving and storing up and getting ready. We're almost there, just not yet. But thank you, right? Like, really be on the same team with your body.
Mm.
Even the night before, like, of course, you're going to feel some of that. And a lot of people get worried about, like, what if I don't sleep? I always encourage people, it's great if you can sleep. And it's actually not going to be the end of the world if you don't get a great night of sleep, especially the night before. And especially if in like the week before you've been able to get some good nights of sleep, and, 2 and 3 days before, that's fine. So even if you don't get a lot of sleep, like, trust that you can rest. You can continue to have that kind conversation with your body. Like, we're good. Thank you. In the morning, we're going to be ready, but now it's okay to sleep and rest, and like have that conversation kind of like you're talking to a young kid, in the way that you'd just be like kind, and not judgmental and angry, because that's going to increase activation. And then the morning of, specifically, I think one of the easiest ways to frame kind of how we navigate or regulate our nervous system level of activation is we just look at our sensory input. So what we see and hear and smell and taste and touch and feel,
Mhm.
those are going to be major sources of information for our nervous system, particularly our survival brain, as to whether we need to like turn it up or calm it down. And so if you are someone who feels like you actually want to be pretty energized, then you might do things like pick maybe the type of music that you're listening to, or if you're going to be like in conversation with other people, or if you're going to do some like, bouncy, jump around, kind of like activate your body type of energy, that can be super helpful for turning things up. And for more of us who are already pretty hyped up and we need to like regulate down, then I always encourage people to pay really close attention to what sensory information you're putting in. So, my
Mhm.
favorite tools on like race day sort of morning are what you hear and what you see and what you feel, sort of physical, tactile, as well as just kind of the energy. Those are three really big, sensory inputs that are going to influence. So, if you, are going to be getting on a bus and riding to Hopkinton and then being at the Athletes Village and then getting down to the starting corrals, and you're just around thousands of people for hours beforehand,
Mhm.
I would say bring a pair of sunglasses, whether ones that you're going to run with or ones that you don't even mind like getting rid of. Or if your warm clothing that you're going to wear, you can have a hood, or a hat or a visor. Again, not things you have to run with, but that you might sort of have and bring with you, or simply practice like closing your eyes more often or looking down at the ground so that visually your brain does not have to do the sorting and processing of millions of bits of information that are actually going to just fatigue your brain from trying to process. Is this a threat? Is this safe? What's going on? What is this? It's just too much information.
Mhm.
In terms of your what you hear, if you have access to music, or you're going to listen to have earbuds in your ears or that sort of thing, really picking sounds. Doesn't have to be music. It could be like sounds of nature, or even just noise canceling that is conducive to the kind of energy that your body is going to benefit from. And this really varies. Like, I know people, I was a rower in college, and we used to often listen to music during erg tests, when we like sit down and do 2,000 meters on the erg as fast as you can. It's pretty common for people to listen to like pretty like intense, like techno, like sometimes rage filled music, because the cadence is
Yeah.
so fast.
Yeah.
um, however, I'm a pretty like highly activated. I don't use I like don't take in caffeine. I'm like a pretty energetic person, just by normative states. And so I don't need more when I'm in that environment. I would like
Mhm.
cry every time I would walk to the gym to take my erg test, just to like release and sort of like let it out. And then I would get on the erg, and I would I would listen to Gregorian chant, like
Oh, wow.
super duper chilled out music, like really
Wow.
chilled out. I know a lot of people who will run to like really high, like upbeat. I listen to like, if I listen to music at all, I listen to like acoustic guitar because I need more calm than I
Yeah.
need activated. So you want to know what works, and you can kind of play with that. But so listening to music or sounds that are going to be just beneficial for your state. And my very favorite in terms of the audio is earplugs. So
Mm.
actually, because some people don't want to bring the headphones or can't, and battery and all that stuff. But even if you just have like good construction quality earplugs that just dim the din of all of the noise all the time, you can still hear people, but you don't have to sort of hear everything. It's certainly going to preserve some of that like nervous system activation. um, and then physically, in terms of like the touch piece, like making sure that you are as warm as you need to be and as cool as you need to be. So temperature regulation can be really helpful.
Mhm.
Even if you need to have like mylar blankets ahead of time, or extra layers if it's a chilly morning. And just like things that the physical touch of are pretty comfortable for you, like noticing what makes a difference. If you've got something that you've got like throwaway clothes, which a lot of people do for Boston, I say make sure they're at least comfortable throwaway clothes, rather than
That's a
sort
good
of being
point.
in an uncomfortable state. That sort of physical touch, your skin, receives a lot of that information, and it can totally like dial you up in terms of agitation, or dial you down in terms of being like nice and chill where you need to be. So
Yeah.
and
That's
then
incredible.
internally, there's always like the thoughts and the visuals that you can like use. And those are a lot of the tools that I work on with people, so we get more specific about individualized.
Yeah, that is incredible. I'm thinking back to my marathon PRs in Chicago. That
Hmm.
was like the such a great city. It's such a great race.
Yeah.
And my mom brought me like an old hoodie that she
Hmm.
had.
Hmm.
And I used that as like my throwaway hoodie, and I had the
Yep.
best race of my life.
Yeah.
Maybe connected, maybe not.
I mean, we can certainly see why there are plenty of factors that might have been helpful for you, right? Like
Yeah.
just the emotional association of like this is your mom's, and that feeling of like being held and warm and cozy, and it might have even
Yeah.
smelled like her, and you could
Yeah.
put your hood up and have a little bit of your own private space, and like
Yep.
these things really do matter. And you think about it, like for those of us who aren't running in like the elite group, they're they're physically in a building. They're
Mhm.
inside at Boston, and then
Yeah.
they just scoot out to the starting line. And so a lot of those things are much more attended to. And so it's not that everyone is going to get to be, have that sort of elite experience, but we can certainly think about what are the factors that influence us versus
Mhm.
what choice do I have about how I'm influencing how I feel. So,
Yeah. That's powerful.
yeah.
Do you think there's any benefit to an athlete thinking about worst case scenario going into a race?
Hmm. Yeah.
Preparing for the worst, hoping for the best sort of
Yeah.
analogy? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a really important distinction that I make, and I think this comes up, when we talk about. I know Tamana mentioned it in her conversation with you, kind of the role of anxiety and how, like, anxiety actually is an adaptive human function. Everybody has it, and the reason that we have it is because we do expect that challenging things are going to happen, but we have to be able to learn from those and, like, get
Mhm.
better at them. And essentially that's what anxiety does, is it remembers these challenging experiences that we've had in the past. So we have knowledge of something being a potential. And anxiety is just sort of this kick up of energy. It's this, like, prompt that feels like an activating energy, and the
Mhm.
whole purpose of that activation of energy is to do something effective to prepare yourself better for that situation. Okay. So it is incredibly helpful, especially if you already have some thoughts that are starting to occur, that are like, but what if that happens? Or what if that happens? So the what ifs, right? What if I
Mhm.
drop my gel? What if I don't eat that gel? What if I am off pace? Like those kinds of things. Um, and so, if in thinking about them, you start to feel that sort of activation of, like, but what if it happens? But what if it happens? Okay. And here's the distinction: if we can consider that situation in order to actually answer the question, what if that does happen? So, what if you do drop your gel? What are your choices? Remember, going back to having choices.
Yeah.
What are your choices when you drop a gel?
Yeah.
Let's play this out. So, what would theoretically the choices be if you had gels to take in and you dropped one?
It would be to either continue running
Yep,
or to stop and pick it up.
that's right.
Hopefully, there's an emergency gel in the pocket, which is
Okay.
always what I
Ooh,
recommend.
which that might not have been in the plan, but might be the result of literally thinking through this. So,
Yeah.
if your choices are to continue running and take the next gel now, or stop and try to pick it up, we don't necessarily know what the very best selection of those two choices is going to be right in this
Mhm.
second, because we don't
Yeah.
know where you are in the course and what the conditions are. If you stop short
Can you
and
imagine?
someone tumbles over you and knocks you into the ground, like, that could be rough. And so,
Yeah.
depending on the moment, we're going to trust, and this is going to be the plan based on thinking through this, that the plan will be, you now know you have those two options, and if it feels safe and possible, like feasible, to pick up the gel, you might choose to do that. And if it doesn't, then you simply go, that happened, and you continue running, and you take the
Mhm.
next gel that's in your pouch. Okay.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if that might be something that happens, then is there anything else that you want to do in preparation for this specific thing that's going to happen? And that's where, if you hadn't already anticipated, you go, I'm going to bring an extra gel, because the chances that I drop one of the, six that I'm going to have is possible, but it's not super likely I'm going to drop two. And even if I did, I would still be able to get one on the course, because they will have fuel at a certain point, just not that early. And so I will be able to fuel. And that's the conclusion of walking through that scenario. I will have choices I can make. I will have the presence of mind to make the best choice based in that moment, and I will be okay. Okay. That's helpful, very helpful.
Yeah.
So if we go back to that delineation, where it's not helpful is when we go, oh my gosh, what if that happens? And then we think, "Oh, that would be the worst." And then we continue feeling anxious. We go, yeah, but what if it happens? Oh my God, that'd be so awful. My race would be over, it'd be ruined. Oh God, what if it happens? And we just spin. Okay.
Mhm.
So the energy that anxiety naturally and importantly activates in us only gets expended to think about how bad it would be. And then that activates more energy to then think about how bad it would be to activate more energy. And we literally spin. So that's not effective anxiety. That's dysfunctional anxiety. Okay.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
action that we take, and it is often really helpful to walk through this with someone. So it is something I do with just about everybody who's preparing for a marathon as a part of the specific like mental race planning, is we actually
Yeah.
go through and I say, and what are you worried about? Like, what's
Yeah.
coming up? Let's talk through so that at the end of this conversation, you literally have a plan or a decision already made for every single one of these, so that
It's
you do recognize things might happen. I don't know when they'll happen. I don't know exactly what form or fashion they'll happen, but the bigger message and the skill that you're actually building as you work through those scenarios is sort of learning like, all right, so no matter what happens, I do have choices. I'm going to be able to make the best decision in that moment, which I'll know, and I'll figure out how to be okay. All right. And like, anxiety goes down. And that's the
yeah.
whole point, because the anxiety has functionally prompted us to be better prepared.
That's amazing. And I'm laughing. I don't know if the microphone can pick up on it. I know you can see me laughing because I can relate.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that has been me.
See?
And I think a lot of us can relate to that. What is what are your thoughts on chunking a marathon and
Mhm.
how important is it to chunk versus going into a 26.2 or maybe a 13.1 10K,
Mhm.
thinking about it as a race as a whole?
Well, since you have talked to Tamana, and I'm gonna keep plugging that episode because it's a great one for people to listen to if they
Savannah's
haven't
great.
already. Um, I'm a really big fan of chunking, which is the like what we
Mhm.
call breaking down a much bigger goal into pieces that feel manageable. Um, and specifically in running, I believe very, very firmly that none of us, not a single one of us, has the capacity or sort of the wherewithal in our brains to look at something like 26.2 miles, um, and in one step or one action, one sort of completion of like, oh, I know how to do that. We just don't know how to do that in one piece, so it's too big.
Mhm.
Ultras are the same. I actually think when it comes down to racing, 10K is probably also like too big to think about. Um, but ultimately, what we're looking for, and this is how I go about navigating that chunking process, is, and the reason behind it is that because when I think about 26.2, I don't have this intuitive sense of like, oh yeah, I know how to do that. Because I don't know how to do that, my brain intellectually, but then also my like survival brain, the lower parts of my brain start to go, oh God, I don't know how to do that. So we start getting defensiveness, protection, and withdrawal. That's the
Mm.
natural response that we don't have. It's like biological, as programmed in. When something is too big, we back up. Like, think about that. Literally, we back up because it's too big. We need to get a better perspective on it, right? But we back up, we
Mhm.
back off, we back away to protect ourselves when something's too big in order to figure out what our resources are or figure out how to tackle it. So, chunking is a way of right sizing the challenge into pieces that feel manageable And my metric for doing that is I'm looking at what is the size of a piece that when you think about it, when you look at it, even under the most challenging circumstances. So, like what is the distance or the time, the piece of running that you could do no matter what. Like if I woke you up in the middle of the night and you hadn't slept well for 3 nights before that, and you had something big to do in the morning, and I was like, you have to run. And I said, but you have to run 3 miles. You'd be like, okay, I can do it. But
Yeah.
then I can go back to bed. Like, so it's usually not a great big piece. It's usually something like 2 or 3 or 4 miles. It might be a time frame. For some people, it's not a specific distance. It's like a place. It's like a start point and a destination point that they run really frequently. So what I really like to do is play with people, but I call it your like hell yes or like of course I
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
distance. Um,
Yeah.
and that becomes sort of the starting point. There's some other elements that I like to play with in that, but that becomes a starting point for if you can think about under even the most challenging conditions that you would say, of course I can do that. Then at no point in your marathon should you think about anything bigger than the chunk that you go, of course I can. Because what better way to keep you in a state of like openness and curiosity rather than fear and protection? So I do with everybody that I work through mental race plans for races with. There are a few more kind of layers that get into the specifics of like the course that you're working on and other kind of details that for you make it really kind of work and fit. That address certain things like most of one very little trick that I will share with everybody is that if in chunking your pieces have you land right on the half marathon, like, and that gets me perfectly to 13. I say make an off-sized piece, make one smaller or one bigger that covers like across the middle of the half, so that you do not have the experience, even with your chunking, of kind of forcing yourself to be like, I'm halfway, wherein you almost inevitably go, how do I feel? Could I do more than like double that? And no one says yes because it just doesn't feel good. So I always encourage your chunks to span the middle. Like get from 12 to 14 rather than like get to 13.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm a super big fan of it. And I just find it to be this incredibly empowering experience. It ties back to what I was describing about the meaning, your performance standards, like looking at what's meaningful and how do I get good feedback along the way. By having those chunks, you have this very clear evidence of progression, evidence of I am
Mhm.
competently moving from one chunk to the next chunk to the next chunk. And it also it references that skill of being able to hold your focus, hold your attention in a place that's going to be helpful. Because if I can look at the first, three miles or 5 miles and just go like, I'm just warming up and I don't have to think about anything else. I'm just warming up. I just know what it feels like to get started. I'm not working too hard, but like I'm just warming up into this. And I really hold the boundary in my focus of this being just that. I I don't feel scared. I don't feel overwhelmed. I can do that. And then when I get done with that, I get to go, I did it. Like, done. That piece is done. And then like, okay, next chunk, which I did just run those miles, but emotionally, I might feel a bit of a like, okay, clean slate, fresh start. Like, what's next? And that's a huge
Mhm.
benefit. So we're always looking for these ways that we can gain a benefit, right? Use that psychological advantage, and how we frame it absolutely makes a difference.
Yeah, definitely. And that buoy is there supporting
Mhm.
you as you're going through it.
Yeah.
Do you have any general chunking tips for anyone who is running the Boston Marathon this year or maybe in future years? Because it is a very different type of course.
It
It's
is.
pretty technical,
Yeah.
and there is a certain way to run it to maybe feel as good as you can feel in the last half of the race. Do you have any chunking tips for Boston?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, because there is that sort of element initially of the course being downhill, and then you have like a lot of miles in between, and then there's really the start of the mile, like the big hills, those that sequence of four hills that finishes with the final heartbreak hill, starting at mile 20 and going up to 21. And so those hills, some people consider them starting at 15 and some people say 16, but in that part of the marathon where you're like, it's already hard, why do I need to add hills? So if I would generally say for people to look at that whole first segment of the marathon up to where you consider the hills starting, and look to simply break that into smaller pieces that make sense for you. This
Mhm.
is totally the kind of thing too that if somebody's like, Emily, I don't know what you're talking about, like email me and we can like, I'm happy to work with people and figure this out. But I would say find those smaller pieces that have that kind of course I can, feel to them, for that whole first segment. And even though there's some elevation down, the first chunk should really be more about like finding your rhythm, finding your race, kind of settling in, tuning in.
Mhm.
And that I do encourage people to like place a chunk across the span of the midway point so that even though you're crossing that time mat, you're not like, okay, halfway, you're just like deep in the middle of that little segment, and so you get to the other side of it and you're more than halfway done. um, and then it really would depend in terms of the section of hills, whether, for someone, they want to approach it, and frame it for themselves as like one segment, like here are the hills, and I'm just gonna like dive in, and I'm gonna be swimming hills until I get to the far side of heartbreak. Or if you're familiar enough with the course that you can sort of make the distinction, because some people are like, when does one hill end and the next one start? But if you can make that distinction, I know a lot of people actually really benefit from, um, kind of zooming in and tackling each hill as its own sort of success. I
Mhm.
actually worked with, someone a few years ago who made how they approached the hills their entire race. So we actually framed for them that their race, their starting line was mile 15 and their
Nice.
finish line was mile 22. And they
Mhm.
had a very clear purpose and theme and word for each of the hills. And that was just this very kind of zoomed in way to approach that for her. Um, and then, for a lot of people, just getting to the top of Heartbreak Hill, which is mile 21, is sort of a big success. I really like to give to like I encourage people to make that sort of mental break at mile 22, because you get to then feel that whole downhill, the backside of Heartbreak into Cleveland
Yeah.
Circle as a part of, like the hill experience. Like it's the reward on the other side of it. Um,
Recovery, it feels good.
yeah, and
Nice.
then the other reason for that is because at mile 22, which is Cleveland Circle, you really make a pretty distinct like turn on the course.
Mhm.
It's one of what feels like the very few turns. There's like 3, 4 of them on the on the whole course, and that's one of them. And then you really have this very what feels like a very long straightaway from mile 22 all the way to Kenmore Square, which is only about a mile from the finish. Um, and so you just know that you have this, there's a there's some gradual up and down, as you
Mhm.
said, like it's sort of this rolling hills, but it's just very kind of straight away. So really being able to then even chunk that, into
Mhm.
maybe two pieces, and then that final sort of mile, you see the mile marker 25, you go through Kenmore Square where you see the Sitco sign, and then there's a sign that says like 1 mile left, and so just allowing yourself to kind of take in that last mile, and do what you can as you go under Mass Ave and turn right on Hereford and left on Boylston. And then just remember that Boylston Street is very, very long, and that even though
It
you can see
is.
the finish line from that turn left onto Boylston, It is not sprintable for
No.
anyone. It's about a half a
No.
mile,
It is.
if not more. It's a long ways. And so just remember that it's quite a ways out. So it's worth just like enjoying taking in that last bit, that last stretch.
We're laughing because we know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
long. It is long.
Yeah.
I've heard it like I heard someone reference 600 meters and I'm like, "Oh no. That straightaway is not 600 meters."
Well,
It's
it's yeah, I mean, I we could probably look at a map, but if we just use the
yeah.
streets, like the finish line is between Dartmouth and Exeter, and the streets go alphabetically. So let's just say it's pretty close, and it's very close to Dartmouth. So we get Exeter, Fairfield, Gloucester, Hereford. It is 4+ blocks away. So it really is about a half a mile.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but the
almost.
energy's incredible. The crowd support's
And the
incredible,
street's
and you
very wide.
it is very wide.
Yeah.
It's like the only time the street is wide and
Yeah,
you have, like,
exactly.
space.
And so it feels kind of amazing because 'cause you're just like, "Ah." And I think
Yeah,
because it's wide and because there are so many people and because it's straight and the finish line is quite large,
it's
but it
huge.
looks like it's not far away, and so it's this sort of confusion of perception. It's like an
Yeah,
illusion. But just know, like, just stay within yourself.
it's
And
great
like and
advice.
just keep on it. I say when you turn left onto Boylston, stay until you are absolutely certain that you are at the finish line. Unless you feel like you have a ton to give, just turn and stay. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so great. It's such a cool experience, making those last few
Yeah.
turns, and experiencing the Boston Marathon, and that finish line is just so incredible too. It's huge, it's massive.
Yeah.
Before I let you go,
Yeah.
I'd love for you to share, quickly, if you can, the story or kind of what you shared with me before we started
Mhm.
recording with how running is like being in a relationship.
Yeah. Well, so anyone who does it at any point, seek out working with me individually, you will have or will hear me introduce this idea, but it's part of how I get to know people who I'm working with, and just better understand how they see the role of running in their lives. And so, what I ask people to do is to think about, and certainly something anyone who's listening can do for yourself because it's a nice little thought exercise. But to conceptualize your relationship with running, just like you would your relationship with a person. So, if, for example, I said, tell me about your relationship with your best friend, you would probably start that by saying, well, we met back, when we were whatever years old. And then, this is what we did together. And this is how life developed. And then this is how we've stayed connected or had time apart, whatever. And you tell the story of the way this relationship has gone all the way up until the current day. Um, and by looking at your relationship with running and describing your relationship with running in that same way, sort of thinking about how did we meet and how did that relationship develop and what have been some of the like ups and downs and some of the like challenges or times when we've been farther apart or closer, and what's it feel like in that relationship, and what's it like right now, what's the quality of it, and what kind of things do you do together now. It gives both, people who I'm asking about it and me a really good sense of, where we've been and what have been some of the challenges. Where are some of the places where there's some, want or desire, or where are there places where there's some friction or some rub that we could like seek to better understand or resolve. And so it's for me in getting to know people and better understanding like them and their movement practice. It's just a really nice way to introduce that and to make it something that we sort of understand in a way that if I just said like, just tell me about your running, The tendency is more so to go to like, well, I've run these races and like these are my times or these have been my goals. But that part's missing the relational aspect, like and some of the meaning and the depth to that idea of conceptualizing it like a relationship. So
Yeah. I absolutely love that. I think it's something that we could all maybe stop to think about.
mm,
And if this conversation has interest anyone, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to reach out to Emily. She's amazing. She does work with Tamana, who
mm,
is also an Elevate athlete, and Tamana's great. And Tamana has so many great stories about Emily and about race experience where she's running New York City Marathon to finish strong,
mm,
no outcome goal. Like, let's finish this thing healthy, happy, and like, hell yeah,
yeah,
sort of vibes.
yeah.
And then the
After
Houston Half.
overcoming injury and really going into it
Yeah.
with a lot of like hesitation and trepidation, like how am I going to be able to do this because it's not going to go the way that I want to. And like we worked really hard but really clearly on like how, like let's make this a success, like let's make this valuable for you because this isn't just something to tolerate or to dread. This is something that can like add to you and your life and your relationship with running. And it was such a cool turnaround.
It was so cool to watch her and to like hear her after the
Yeah.
fact and like how strong she felt, how
Mm,
excited she was. And I think it really just snowballed and the momentum just grew from there.
yeah.
She ran the Houston half really well.
Yep.
She's going into London and like she's fit, not just physically, but
Yeah.
mentally. And it's exciting.
Yeah, it really is exciting. Yeah, the Houston half as well. I mean, she was like, "I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm signed up. I don't even know if I want to do it." And I was like, "How can we use this? How can we use this? What if it's not just about like it's not just about the outcome, but like what if it's a place to practice some of this?" And like even in that one conversation, she was like, "Yes." I'm like so excited to go and do this. And we really mapped out a specific like mental race plan for her to be able to feel like she could just embrace each of those chunks and like know
Mhm.
what she was doing and be excited about it. And it had purpose and meaning. And it just was like, and then a time was like it is going to happen because you're going to cross the finish line and it does get timed. But it really became like an element, like a detail in this much
Yeah.
richer story that included all these other things that she was really like invested in working on. And it's really kind of freeing the space for her to be able to physically continue like developing and training and be able to do these physical things, but coming from a place of being in a really like strong mental spot.
Yeah, it's been really, really cool to see and like see her progress and
Yeah.
momentum and her strength and her fitness. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, she's so great. And I feel like you really like bring out the best side of her here. I feel
Mm.
like she's here with me right now, just the way you like, yeah, you talk about her. It's like, oh, you've nailed Tamana.
Oh, thank
She's so great.
you.
So are you.
Oh,
Where
thank
can
you.
our yeah. Where can our audience find you if they're looking to reach out with you or looking to reach out to you or work with you?
Yeah. If you are interested in working with me, you can always check out my website if conversation today has piqued your interest or you want to learn more. That's esaulmovement.com is the website. And you can email me esaulmovement@gmail.com in order to just communicate about working together. I am on Instagram. I don't do a lot of like content posting and sharing, but it is a nice way to get connected with people. And I'm Emily Saul Boston on Instagram.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you
Oh,
and all of your advice that you had for our audience today.
thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so much for
much.
having me. And also, I really appreciate the work that you are doing with the athletes that you're working with. I always I get to talk with a lot of people who work with a lot of different running coaches. And I think it is something special when there is a running coach who's really invested in like in the development of people. I know that
Mm.
it speaks to the conversation we had before we started recording, but I really just respect a lot and appreciate the way that you're invested in how people are continuing to improve and invest in their lives and themselves, and not just their running achievements or objectives. I think that certainly enhances the quality of the work that they're getting as athletes, because you care about them as people too. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Humans
Yeah.
first, athletes second. Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah. Thank you so
Oh, you're
much.
welcome.